Hi, this is our presentation of Chapter 9 in the textbook on Causal Comparative Research, presented by myself, Grace Hale, and Maria Trevino. We hope that it helps you understand causal comparative research a little bit better. Well, what is causal comparative research? You've often heard it said that correlation does not imply causation, and that's true. The purpose of causal comparative research, though, is to find out that causation. Causal comparative research attempts to determine the cause or reason for existing differences in the behavior or status of groups or individuals. So we're looking at two or more groups with existing differences and then finding the cause or reason for the differences between the groups. Often you will hear this referred to as ex post facto research or an ex post facto study. That is Latin for after the fact. So the reason people refer to it as ex post facto is because the cause and effect in this study have already occurred. We're not going to create something new. We're not going to cause something to happen. The researcher is going to look at things that have already happened, at cause and effects that have already occurred, and then gather data from that. Causal comparative research is similar to correlational and experimental research, but there are some key differences between those. The differences between causal comparative and correlational relate to the comic that I showed at the very beginning. Causal comparative research attempts to identify the cause-effect relations, whereas correlational does not attempt to identify the cause-effect relations. It's just going to look at a correlation, whereas causal comparative is going to find the cause. Causal comparative studies also are when you look at two or more groups with one dependent variable. Correlational groups are going to look at one group with two or more variables. Those are just some of the key differences between causal comparative and correlational studies. There are also differences between causal comparative and experimental studies. In a causal comparative study, the variable is not manipulated by the researcher. This is really important, and we're going to talk more about it later. In experimental studies, the researcher will manipulate the variable, but that does not happen in a causal comparative study. Also, in a causal comparative study, the participants are already in established groups. In an experimental study, the researcher places the participants in groups. Let's look at an example. A researcher wants to know what differences exist between full-day kindergarten and half-day kindergarten students in mathematics and reading ability as they progress through elementary school. This is going to be a causal comparative study. First of all, we know that because the participants are already in established groups. It's not going to be experimental. The two groups we have are full-day kindergarten and half-day kindergarten. The researcher will not be placing the participants in those groups. The researcher won't say, all right, these kids are going to go to full day, these kids are going to go to half day. Those are already established groups. We can also tell that it's not correlational because we are looking at two or more groups. For instance, in this one, we're looking at two groups, full day and half day. And we're trying to identify cause and effect. For a researcher, the design of a causal comparative study is pretty simple. First, they select two groups that we call comparison groups. And in our example, those were full-day kindergarten and half-day kindergarten students. And those groups differ on some variable of interest. And then the researcher compares them on some dependent variable. The groups are already different. The researcher attempts to identify the factor that led to this difference, or the difference that affects, or how this difference affects something else. There are two main designs, two main types of causal comparative research. There's retrospective causal comparative research. This starts with effects and then investigates the causes. The second design is prospective causal comparative research. This starts with the causes and investigates the effects of those causes. Almost all educational causal comparative research will be retrospective. Throughout causal comparative research, many variables are investigated. Now, we discussed when we explained the differences between causal comparative and experimental that the researchers aren't going to manipulate any of these variables. But there are plenty of types of variables that are investigated in causal comparative studies. One category of variables are organismic variables. Organismic variables are variables that have to do with the characteristic of an organism. For example, age, sex, or ethnicity. These are characteristics of a specific organism. Another category of variables are ability variables. This has to do with an individual's ability to do something. Some examples are intelligence, scholastic aptitude, specific aptitudes, or perceptual ability. The third category of variables to be investigated in a causal comparative study are personality variables. These have to do with an individual's personality. Some examples would be anxiety level, aggression level, self-esteem, aspiration level, brain dominance, or even learning style. The fourth category is family-related variables. This is pretty self-explanatory. All of these variables have to do with the family. Some examples are family income, socioeconomic status, birth order, number of siblings, family environment, even things like the marital status of parents or the employment status of the mother or father are all family-related variables. And finally, just like family-related variables, we have school-related variables. Again, it's pretty self-explanatory. These are any variables that have to do with school. Some examples would be preschool attendance, the size of the school, peer pressure, teaching style, even the type of school. For example, is it public or is it private? Is it private Christian or is it private secular? Is it a charter school? These are all examples of school-related variables. Now pay attention, this is a very important note. Most causal comparative variables cannot or should not be manipulated. This is very important to understand. We'd like to be able to say that all causal comparative variables cannot or should not be manipulated, but there are some that could, but we don't when we're doing causal comparative variables. However, a lot of them, almost all of them, cannot or should not be manipulated. For example, the organismic variables, age, sex, or ethnicity, those cannot be manipulated. A researcher cannot change the age of somebody or the ethnicity of one of their participants. Other variables, such as intelligence or anxiety level, those can't be manipulated either. Family-related variables. Look at family income, for instance. Could that be manipulated? Well, I guess technically, if the researcher gave the family extra money or took some money away from them, you could say that technically it would be manipulated, but it should not be manipulated. A lot of this has to do with earlier this course when we talked about our ethics in research. There are some things that researchers cannot manipulate. Researchers cannot have somebody smoke more cigarettes for their study. Ethically, that should not be manipulated. It is not healthy. And there are lots of variables that researchers just can't manipulate. So if you're looking at a study and the variables cannot or should not be manipulated, that might help you see that this is a causal comparative study. Or when you're trying to figure out what type of study you're going to do, if you shouldn't manipulate any of the variables, consider doing a causal comparative study. For the design of our causal comparative study, you have different comparison groups. These are the 2 or more groups that you are going to look at and compare. Now, these groups are broken up based on 2 different things. The first way that we break up comparison groups is when one group possesses a characteristic that the other does not. One group is going to have something, the other group is not going to have that thing. Let's look at an example. How does having a single parent family affect a student's academic achievement? So we're looking at single parent families and how that affects student academic achievement. What are our 2 comparison groups in this example? Well, here they are. We have one group that are single parent families and one group that are families with 2 parents. The characteristic is 2 parents. So here we have one group has 2 parents, the other group does not have that. And these are our comparison groups. Another way to split up your comparison groups is where both groups, or all groups if you have 3 or more, have the characteristic, but to differing degrees or amounts. So all the groups being studied or compared are going to have this characteristic, but at different degrees or amounts. Let's look at another example. What is the relationship between years of experience and job satisfaction? What's our characteristic? Our characteristic is years of experience. Everybody in this study is going to have some form of experience, but to different degrees. The degrees are going to be the years. So one group is maybe a group of people who've worked for 2 years. That's their degree of experience. Maybe another group is everybody that's worked for 25 years. So all the groups are going to have this characteristic, but to differing degrees. And then they're looking at the years of experience in comparison to job satisfaction. So those are the 2 main ways that we break up comparison groups. Either one does or one doesn't have a characteristic, or they both have a characteristic at different levels. Let's look at an example. This is how a researcher would go through the process of a causal comparative study. A researcher may hypothesize that participation in a preschool education is the major factor contributing to differences in the social adjustment of the first graders. So, the researcher says that participating in preschool contributes to the social adjustment of first graders. How are they going to go about proving this? To examine this hypothesis, the researcher would select a sample of first graders who had participated in preschool education and a sample of first graders who had not participated in preschool education. Again, these groups are predetermined. It is not an experimental study. The researcher isn't saying this group will go to preschool, this group won't go to preschool. These are groups that have already participated. So we're looking back or have already not participated. Then the researcher compares the social adjustment of the 2 groups. Remember, these groups are predetermined. If the children who participated in preschool education exhibited a higher level of social adjustment than the other group, the researcher's hypothesis would be supported. So what about the hypothesis? What should the hypothesis look like in a causal comparative study? Well, the hypothesis is going to be very similar to a hypothesis for an experimental study. Here's an example. It is hypothesized that students in Miss Cass's class who received instruction with the new reading strategy that Miss Cass has implemented have made increased gains in fluency. What are our 2 groups that we're looking at in this study? Well, one of the groups is those who have received instruction with the new reading strategy. which means the other group is those who have not received instruction with a new reading strategy. Again, these are predetermined groups. They've already had or have not had the reading strategy. And we're splitting up the groups based on one having a characteristic and one not having that characteristic. And then we're going to compare how receiving or not receiving this instruction relates to gains in fluency. It's important to be careful. When you're stating the hypothesis, researchers must carefully consider other explanations, such as reverse causation. Due to the nature of a causal comparative study, since you can't really set up the study exactly how you want, since there are pre-existing groups, you need to make sure that there's no other reason that you're getting the data you're getting. One of the other explanations could be reverse causation. Here's an example. If a researcher looked at a group of students who had high test anxiety on a test and then failed the test, they might look at it and say, all these students had test anxiety and did poorly on the test. That means test anxiety causes poor test grades. That's what they're saying is the causation. The causation of the poor test grades is test anxiety. However, the reality might be that the students who did poorly didn't study. They weren't prepared. They didn't understand the material, perhaps. So when they went to take the test, they began working on the problems, and the further along they got on the test, they realized, wow, I don't actually understand this. I don't know these questions, which caused their test anxiety to increase because they knew they didn't know the answers and they were struggling trying to remember something they didn't study. Which means that the reality is their lack of preparation, their poor grades actually caused their test anxiety. The researchers stated it the other way around. Their test anxiety is what caused their poor grades. But it's really their poor grades that caused their test anxiety, or their lack of preparation that caused both. So be careful when you're reading somebody else's causal comparative study or when you're working on your own to make sure that all the other explanations that you can account for them, or that you've at least considered them, including reverse causation. Let's talk about the data that you will get with your causal comparative study. For the descriptive statistics, most causal comparative studies are going to use mean and standard deviation. Mean, again, is the average of all of your scores, and standard deviation is how spread out all of your scores are from the average. So that's the descriptive statistics that almost all causal comparative studies are going to use. The inferential statistics that are used are the t-test, the analysis of variance, and the chi-square. The t-test is used to determine whether the scores of two groups are significantly different from one another. So if you're just looking at two groups, that's what you're going to use. If you're looking at three or more groups, you're going to look at the analysis of variance. Your analysis of variance is used to test for significant differences among the scores for three or more groups. And your chi-square is going to look at something completely different. That's going to be used to compare the frequency of one group, the frequency of an event or an occurrence in one group as compared to another. So how frequently does one thing happen in one group versus how frequently does that happen in another group? Here's a really good quote from the textbook that I thought was important in understanding causal comparative studies. Analyzing the findings of causal comparative study requires considerable caution. The alleged cause-effect relation may be the effect and vice versa, or a third factor may be the cause of both variables. This is really important in understanding the data that you're getting. Since you aren't manipulating any of the variables, since this has already occurred and you're just looking at the data, it's important to make sure that you look over the findings and analyze them again and again to make sure that what you're saying is the cause and effect is actually the cause and effect. Every research plan has a method section. While most method sections talk about a description of the research participants, the measuring instruments, the design and the procedure, the method section for a causal comparative study is going to be a little different simply because of the design of a causal comparative study. Due to the nature of causal comparative studies, the description of the two groups selected for the study must be thorough. In your method section, you aren't going to say how you selected your groups. You're not going to explain how you randomized the groups and how you selected them because you can't randomize in a causal comparative study. Instead, you will just describe your two groups and explain maybe how you made them as similar as possible, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. Since most of the study takes place after the fact, most of the method will be explaining the differences and similarities of the groups and the effects of those different variables. Again, you aren't manipulating any of the variables. Everything that you're studying has already happened. You're just looking at the data and gathering more data for something that's already happened. So, in your methods section, you'll talk about how you're going to gather that data, how you're going to interpret that data, what measuring instruments either have been used or will be used. And you can talk about your participants, but you can't describe how you randomize them because you can't do that. This is another important thing to remember in a causal comparative study. The more similar the groups are, except for the studied variable, the more valid the results are. Think back to our first example. We had full day kindergarten and half day kindergarten. And we wanted to look at the effects of full day and half day kindergarten on reading and mathematic abilities as they progress through elementary school. If our two groups were different in size, say the full day kindergarten had 3 kids in it, small Christian school, half day kindergarten had 15 kids in it, we couldn't determine if the results were because of class size or if they were because the difference in full day versus half day. So we need to make sure that the more similar our groups are, except for the studied variable, the more valid the results are. One of the main problems with causal comparative studies, the main issue, is that because the groups are already predetermined, they're preset, there's a lack of randomization, a lack of manipulation, and a lack of control over the groups. So, how do we deal with that as researchers? We can't randomize the groups because the groups have variables that we can't control, whether it's age or whether it's gender or whether it's socioeconomic status. There are things we can't control and the groups are preset. So how do we deal with it? There are 3 different ways. The first is through matching. And this is really interesting. When you're going to use matching, you need to match the participants in one group with the participants in another group who have the same or similar scores on the control variable. So, if you have 2 high school classes and you want to use one class is going to learn this new teaching method for reading, and then you're going to look at reading comprehension. And the other group isn't going to use the new teaching strategy. And again, you're going to look at their reading comprehension. So you're going to compare group A and group B. One is getting new teaching method, one is not. And you're going to look at their reading comprehension at the end of the study. Again, this is stuff that's already occurred. If in group A, you have a student who has an IQ of 140, you should try to make sure that in group B, there is also a student who has an IQ of 140. And you're actually going to try to match up all the participants so that the extra factors or variables aren't going to be at play as much as the one that you want to look at. So if group A, they all had a higher IQ and group B didn't, who knows if really it's the new teaching method or if it's their IQ that's bringing across higher reading scores. So you need to make sure that you're trying to match the participants in one group with the participants in another group. Another way to deal with this issue is through comparing homogeneous groups or subgroups. Only compare groups who are from similar backgrounds. If you were going to do a study of 2 first grade classrooms and their reading levels, and one group is going to have nightly reading homework, and the other group, group B, is not going to have nightly reading homework. They're not going to have any reading homework all year. And you want to compare the effects of reading homework on reading ability or on their reading comprehension levels. You want to make sure that those groups are from similar backgrounds. If group A is a small class of 10 kids at a Christian school, and group B is a large class of 30 kids from a public school, we aren't able to tell if the difference in reading level is due to the homework or due to the small classroom size or due to the type of school. So if you're doing a study like this, you would want to make sure that both groups have the same amount of students or a similar amount of students, that both groups are either public school or both groups are either private school. And so you want to make sure that you're comparing homogeneous groups or subgroups, and that's going to help validate your results. Another way to deal with this is the analysis of covariance. This is a statistical technique for adjusting initial group differences on the variables used. This is at the beginning. You're going to look at the group differences and you're going to adjust them statistically for these variables. This is a little about causal comparative research. I hope that this helped you understand more of Chapter 9 and of this specific methodology.